My bad neighbor. For most of my childhood, my family and I lived one house away from a pedophile. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Mr. Stan. Our old neighborhood started at the top of a hill and went down to a small lake where the road turned right and branched off into a cul-de-sac and another residential road. Mr. Stan's house was at the top of the hill, and ours was in the middle. Mr. Stan lived in the neighborhood long before we moved in. It's hard for me to remember any vivid details about him, as I was very young at the time. But what I do remember is that every time he saw us, his face would scrunch up as if he smelled something terrible. There was one house between his place and ours, something I'm very grateful for. I don't know what life would have been like if we lived right next to him. Right from when we were little, my parents were very strict about walking past Mr. Stan's house. They told us that Mr. Stan was sick in the head, and if he ever asked us to come into his house, we were never, ever allowed to do so by ourselves. For years, no one told us exactly why Mr. Stan was bad, but we didn't need details. We just knew to avoid him. The look he gave us whenever he was working on his car or planting flowers in his garden was clearly more than enough. When my sister and I would walk up the hill to school, we would cross the street when we got to his place, just to be safe. Like I said, I don't remember very much about Mr. Stan, and his twisted story begins long before I was even born. For this, I turned to my mom to fill in the details. Mom said that before we'd even ever moved into the cul-de-sac, around the late 70s, early 80s, Mr. Stan already had the reputation of being a heavy drinker. He would get drunk and go over to the house of the family right across the street from us. It was said that he did terrible things to the daughter while she was babysitting. The daughter tried to tell her mother about it, but since she was a rebellious child, her mother didn't believe her. Her family and Mr. Stan's family were very good friends, to be honest. Mr. Stan worked as a corrections officer, and soon accusations surfaced that Mr. Stan and another officer regularly molested their co-workers' kids. Mr. Stan was able to avoid conviction by ratting out the other officer, but in the process, he lost his job. As far as I know, he never really worked after that. Mr. Stan had two daughters of his own, and while the older one claimed she was molested and suffered from mental problems as a result, the younger one said she was never mistreated in any way, and she grew up to be a very positive person. Mr. Stan's wife stood by her husband and claimed he was innocent throughout the whole ordeal. Ironically, the older daughter's emotional instability resulted in her children going to live with the grandpa. More on that in a second. When my family moved into our house in the cul-de-sac, our next-door neighbor, a kind but nosy old man, told my dad to keep my sister and I away from Mr. Stan. He told my parents to gossip and Mr. Stan's history with children, which understandably horrified them both. As a result, my mom and my dad were wary of him from the start, rightfully so. Mr. Stan was cordial enough. He would wave hello to my family and all that neighborly stuff. According to my mom, he even offered to babysit my little sister and I, to which my parents politely but emphatically declined. Then, sometime around 2002, my dad was going to work when he came across a neighborhood kid, let's call her Lana, on her way up the street. My dad is a chatty person, so he asked Lana what she was up to. Lana told him that she was going to Mr. Stan's house to give him a back rub. Dad knew that something was off, so he told Lana's parents. To his surprise, they weren't alarmed at all and said that sort of thing happened all the time. According to Mom, when Lana was older, Dad asked her if Mr. Stan ever acted inappropriately towards her during those visits, Her answer was, definitely. When my sister was in kindergarten and I was in grade 3, Mr. Stan's grandkids came to live with him and his wife for reasons I mentioned earlier. My parents couldn't believe this was allowed by anyone, especially considering the allegations and neighborhood gossip around him. His granddaughter was in the same kindergarten class as my sister, and his grandson was about my age. Mom told me it was so disturbing to see the sweet little granddaughter at school every day and know what was probably going on behind closed doors. My parents have always had strong morals, particularly my dad. They would often talk about what they should do. They wanted to report Mr. Stan to the authorities before any harm could come to his grandchildren. Mom and Dad knew that if they reported Mr. Stan, they would be putting themselves at risk. The rest of the neighborhood was no help either. Mom said it was as if they were all hiding under rocks and turning a blind eye to what was happening. In the end, my parents' strong morality won out, and they decided, with the risk of being exposed as whistleblowers, to report Mr. Stan to the principal. The principal, in turn, called the ministry, who sent people to Mr. Stan's house for home visits and investigations. In the end, it was decided that the grandchildren would be removed from Mr. Stan's house. Mom isn't sure how it happened, but somehow it leaked that my parents were the ones who reported Mr. Stan as a child molester. She thinks Lana's family may have had a hand in it. And as Mom put it, that's when the real fun began. Mr. Stan was no longer friendly towards my family. No more waves, no more chit-chat. Instead, he would target my mom with his car if she was walking down the road alone, or scream obscenities at my dad as he went to work. A few times, he crossed the center line to scare us if we passed each other while driving. He told my dad that he ruined his life and that he was a horrible person. Thinking about that now really boils my blood, because my dad is one of the kindest and most considerate men I know. Mom was miserable and wanted to move, but Dad, as unshakable as he is, said he wasn't in a hurry. Mom told me it took 3 years of house hunting before she finally convinced Dad it was time to go. Only after all of this, when we'd been living in our beautiful new home out in the country, did I finally start to uncover the details to the story. But sadly, it didn't end there. After we moved out of the cul-de-sac, Lana and other girls who were now grown up came forward to report Mr. Stan and what he'd done. He was hauled into court for a second time. This time, there was no one he could rat on to save himself. The testimony against him was building up. My parents followed the trial in the newspaper every day. They wanted to see him put away for all the terrible things he'd done. I had no memory of these proceedings, of course, and nobody wanted to explain it to me, and I can't blame them for that. Mr. Stan was not only a former corrections officer, but now he was also a convicted pedophile. He knew he wouldn't last long if he went to prison. So, on a quiet morning 1 week before his sentencing, Mr. Stan took a hunting rifle and ended himself. The folks who moved into Lana's house after her family left were walking their kids to school when they heard that shot. Mom told me the image of that scene haunts her to this day. I think she imagines what it would have been like if it were her walking my sister and I to school in place of that other family. Or maybe she was disturbed to learn that Mr. Stan had a gun. I know it sounds harsh, but I'm glad he's gone. He can never hurt another child again. My memories of this whole ordeal are far less interesting than the actual event, but one thing I do remember very clearly is being afraid of Mr. Stan's house. I knew it was dangerous. In my memory, it was painted black with white stucco. The car park and stairs in front of the front door were all underneath the wood roof, which cast the entire front of the house into shadow. To me, it was a monster's home, though I didn't know why. My sister and I only ever went to Mr. Stan's house once, and that was at the front door. It was Halloween, and my parents decided it was okay for us to trick or treat at his house, since they would be standing at the bottom of the stairs anyway. I was actually very reluctant to go, and my parents had to encourage me that it was okay. Mr. Stan's home was the only one that didn't need Halloween decorations to be scary. So my sister and I cautiously climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell. Mr. Stan's wife opened the door. She was kind to us and gave us candy, and I remember being surprised that Mr. Stan's wife was that nice. But what I remember most was that I wanted to see inside the forbidden house. For some reason, this still stuck with me. I looked behind Mrs. Stan, and there was Mr. Stan in a wife-beater top, beer belly and all, sitting in an armchair watching TV. It was dim in the living room, except for a lamp and the glow of the TV. Mr. Stan didn't look at all. For years, I wondered if it was what bad men looked like. When I think about this story now, 11 years later, it really hits me how dark my neighborhood was under the surface. It's quite disturbing to me because my childhood was quite happy. I was too young to notice anything wrong, and I couldn't sense the tension my parents lived with every day. I didn't know how much potential danger my sister and I were in. All I knew was that it was a beautiful day to play with my marbles or go to the lake. But now that I think of that, Mr. Stan may have been the reason my parents bought a copy of You Can Say No, a picture book that teaches children around safety with bad people. I think my parents handled the situation very well, and I'm so thankful they were attentive and brave during the whole thing. This story could have gone very differently. When I think about our old house on the cul-de-sac, it's usually the happy memories I think of first. Mom tells me that despite all the trouble they went through, neither she nor Dad regrets the decisions they made. She left me with one last ominous message. They say that every neighborhood has a pedophile living there. Most of the time, we just don't know it.